I'm John Jacob, McAvoy Family Curator for Photography at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and my paper today is Spirit Portraiture, Rethinking William Mumler Through Posthumous Mourning Portraiture. In the closing paragraphs of his influential essay on spirit photography in 1995, film historian Tom Gunning wrote, quote, "Although I have not established how widespread the practice was, spirit photographs were produced as mourning images in the 19th century. Photographs of dead relatives were knowingly superimposed over photographs of their surviving loved ones, often in watchful and protective stances." The evidence for Gunning's claim was a single photograph dated circa 1870 by an uncredited photographer. In a footnote, Gunning added, "I've found what appears to be a clear example at the George Eastman House archive, in which a phantom image is superimposed over a mantelpiece bearing family photographs," unquote. Gunning's conjecture was that some spirit pictures were made as commissions, as mourning images rather than as evidence for the spiritualist belief that the human spirit survives bodily death. The assertion was unique in the literature on photography, but Gunning never returned to it. Indeed, much of the subsequent literature was written in response to his insights, and those responses shifted scholarly regard for spirit photography from an embarrassing aberration to a critical moment in the social history of photography. While most writers have noted an affiliation of spirit photography with mourning portraiture, none have investigated that affiliation. That investigation is the goal of this essay. For Gunning's claim to be valid, a client must have conveyed two photographs to a portrait studio, where one was duplicated and montaged into the other with the client's consent. Consent implies a difference from images made as evidence for survival. To operate as evidence, spirit pictures were made by photographers who claimed not to know how their results were obtained for clients blinded by religious belief to duplicity. Consent problematizes spirit photography by implying the mutual acknowledgement of the falsified photograph. What is false in spirit photography, Gunning wrote, is its, quote, indexical claim of spirit agency, unquote. The spirit photograph made as a mourning image disclaimed such agency. A question of intention is raised. If it was consented to, can the superimposition be called false? There is little in Gunning's example to suggest the difference attributed to it. In fact, his description of dead relatives, quote, in watchful and protective stances, unquote, better matches another illustration in his text. Credited to William Mumler, the self-proclaimed discoverer of spirit photography, it shows, quote, the widow of President Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, with the apparition of her assassinated husband, unquote. Standing behind Mrs. Lincoln, the spectral figure of the president looks down consolingly, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders. In Gunning's example, by contrast, the spirit stands alone. Gazing at the viewer of the photograph, she dangles a decorative anchor over a carte de visite that has been propped against a union case on an ornate surface. The anchor is a Christian symbol of hope for the afterlife. Here, however, its promise is not the "we shall meet again" of Christianity, but the "I am always with you" of spiritualism. In fact, both photographs are by Mumler. Gunning's example is housed at the George Eastman Museum in an album of 10 spirit photographs. 8 are portraits of living subjects accompanied by spirit extras, like that of Mrs. Lincoln. 8 are iconographically similar, in other words, and 2 are not. Quote, Mumler seems to have set a basic iconography of spirit photography as an extension of portraiture, unquote, Gunning wrote, which was, quote, strictly conventional in pose and composition, unquote. Indeed, it's through their conventionality that the affiliation with mourning portraiture is discernible in these photographs, and it's through its difference from that basic iconography that Gunning's example may be interrogated. To do so, however, I propose to classify the spirit of the practice of spirit portraiture as distinct within the field of spirit photography. I will show that Mumler made photographs of spirits and photographs using fluidic processes. Gunning's example belongs to the second category, Mrs. Lincoln and the 8 portraits in the Eastman album to the first. I shall refer to such iconographically similar images as spirit portraits. The classification is historically accurate. Spirit photographs by Mumler and others of his era were produced in portrait studios modified to double as seance rooms. It also follows recent scholarship in identifying distinct practices of spirit photography. Spirit portraiture was the source from which the photography of fluids evolved as distinct from that of seances, materializations, and so on. No less important than setting was recognition. Recognizing one's loved one in heaven was a theological question on the minds of many in the 19th century. Spirit portraiture's rhetoric of recognition echoed the aesthetic discourse of likeness. Just as painted portraiture was successful to the degree that it offered a likeness of its subject, so the spirit portrait was successful to the degree that the extra was recognizable to its subject. In Mumler's autobiography, each description of a successful sitting was accompanied by the client's testimony of recognition. After photography was adapted by psychical research in the late 19th century, the conventions of portraiture were cast off in favor of newly emerging modes of scientific observation. The iconographic differences of spirit portraiture from such later practices has been missed by those approaching spirit photography as a unified field. It was anything but that. In her research on American memorial art historian Phoebe Lloyd identified the practice of posthumous mourning portraiture flourishing between 1830 and 1860. Quote, "Since the bereaved wished their dead to be restored to them as living presences, it is necessary to define these life portraits as posthumous. And because families commissioned the portraits during the mourning period, the mourning function has to be included in the designation," unquote. Such portraits, she noted, were universally idealizing. Quote, "A delicate balance between life and death was achieved in 2 ways. First, the figure of the deceased, generally life-size, was placed in his former habitual environment. Second, a death symbol was normally included," unquote. Though painted from the corpse, P.R. Vallet's Harriet Mackey depicted its subject as asleep. Her garland is a funeral chaplet, a common symbol of death. Similarly, in Matthew Pryor's Baby in Blue, the child's missing shoe and the bobbin of thread in the foreground both signify a life cut short. Photographers adapted the iconography of posthumous mourning portraiture with mixed results. An advertisement for the studio of Southworth and Hawes in 1846 stated, quote, we take great pains to have miniatures of deceased persons agreeable and satisfactory, and they are often so natural as to seem, even to artists, in deep sleep," unquote. In spite of their best efforts, the realism of photography prevented most practitioners from idealizing their subjects. Anthropologist J. Ruby observed that photography could not satisfy the impulses motivating commissions of posthumous mourning portraiture. Quote, "Painters created the illusion of life in death," Ruby wrote, echoing Lloyd. Incapable of idealizing the corpse, he concluded that the function of post-mortem photography was, quote, "not to keep the dead alive, but to enable mourners to acknowledge their loss," unquote. Spiritualism rejected loss. Quote, "I am always with you," unquote, the spirit Mabel Warren declared to Moses Dow during his sitting with Mumler. It is so beautiful to pass away from earth. I do not wish to come back unless it were to die again. What was demonstrated by Mumler's portrait of Dow and Warren, however, was not an occult encounter. An essential distinction of spirit portraiture is its disclaimer of the supernatural. The 19th century was an era that did not reject miracles, but made allowances for them as anomalous events not subject to natural law. For those who believed its evidence, the spirit portrait was not a miraculous image, but one behaving according to the laws of nature newly revealed by the camera. Among the conventions of memorial portraiture, the picture within a picture functioned as an aid memoir. Writing on Gilbert Stuart's Sarah Shippen Lee, whose subject wears a miniature as a brooch, art historian Margareta Lavelle noted that, quote, the miniature performs the function of mnemonic for Mrs. Lee in the same fashion that her full-scale image on the wall of her home points its viewers to her face, her form, her role, and her position within a family web, unquote. The picture within a picture was a prompt to memory for the subject of the painting when she observed it. It was also a signifier of the duty of remembrance enacted by Mrs. Lee for other observers, for whom her portrait would have served as a constant reminder of the social order within and the duties of family. Photography adapted the picture within a picture as the signal trope of mourning portraiture. Photographers could not idealize the corpse. As the care of the dead moved from the home to the funeral parlor, however, a parallel transition occurred in the portrayal of death, which moved from the home to the photography studio, also known as the photographic parlor. Early photographic mourning images necessarily duplicated a pre-existing painted portrait. By the late 19th century, a preference for photographs supplanted that for the limner, and the painted image was succeeded by one made during a lifetime visit to the studio. Photographic mourning portraiture thus enacted a dual shift, both from the painter to the photographer in the portrayal of death, and from the body of the deceased to that of the mourner as the idealized locus of remembrance. Photographic mourning portraiture embodied the ritual of annually commemorating a death by viewing a memorial portrait. Framing a living subject alongside a lifetime portrait of the deceased, that subject became quite literally a carrier of the dead through the conveyance of images and the enactment of remembrance in them. What made the picture within a picture so affecting was its affirmation of separation. In photographic mourning portraits, a living subject enacted remembrance of the visible but non-present deceased. The frame of the picture within a picture delineated a threshold separating the living from the dead. In spirit portraits, a living subject stood alongside the present but non-visible deceased. Spirit portraiture affirmed an extraordinary co-presence. Mabel Warren was not a remembered subject, but an actually present one. Eliminating the frame of the picture within a picture, spirit portraiture dissolved the threshold separating the living from the dead. Employing the conventions of posthumous mourning portraiture, nevertheless, it rejected death. It was this rejection, not the plainness of its fabrication, that made spirit portraiture so marvelous or objectionable to 19th century viewers. These examples affirm that Mumler did indeed extend the conventions of mourning portraiture to spirit portraiture. Limiting the scope of our inquiry to that practice, it's clear that all such photographs were commissions. The impulse motivating such commissions, whether grief or faith, is unknowable, and it's beside the point, because in either case, the portrait's intent was consolation. Shifting from evidence to effect, the burden of photographic truth, the portrait's supposed indexical claim, was released. No less important than its indexical claim, and likely much more so for most clients, Was the portrait's effective intent? Spiritualism rejected death, not bereavement. Spirit portraiture offered profound consolation. Of a Mr. Liebling who had recently lost a son, Mumler wrote that, quote, having had some experience in spiritualism, he naturally sought for consolation from that source, unquote. After Mumler obtained a recognized likeness, quote, who can describe the joy that filled this father's heart when he discovered that his son was not dead, unquote. With mourning portraiture, the bereaved ritually visited and cared for the dead by visiting and caring for their images. With spirit portraiture, the dead visited the living as images and assuaged their grief with tender caresses. Considered in relation to affect, spirit portraiture exemplifies what Lovell called the subjunctive mode of memorial portraiture, a what if scenario posited by the image. In John Copley's Sir William Pepperell and His Family, the figure of the wife and mother is situated at the painting's center, his firstborn son seated on her lap and reaching out to Sir William, his father, and their benefactor. Commissioned to commemorate the birth of an heir, the portrait did not acknowledge the death of Elizabeth Pepperell after that birth. Responding instead to the motivation for the commission, Lovell wrote, it offered, quote, a manufactured memory, but not a falsified record, unquote, of family obligations and affectionate ties. It imagined the family as it might have been had death not robbed the Pepperells of the prosperity, serenity, and social order that the painting depicts. In a word, it offered consolation. What of Gunning's example? Each of the photographs considered has had in common the conventions of posthumous mourning portraiture. Gunning's example does not. In fact, 2 of the 10 photographs in the Eastman album are highly unconventional. Rather than living subjects accompanied by spirit extras, they show spirits accompanied by photographs. Mumler reported on the origin of these images in his autobiography. Quote, some years ago, a gentleman in California sent me his picture with the request that at a specified time, I would put it on my table and take a likeness of it, as if I had a personal sitting. At the same hour, he would concentrate his mind and request some of his spirit friends to show themselves. The experiment was a success, as on developing the negative, 3 forms were seen which were recognized. Since that time, I have taken many pictures in that way and have given some beautiful tests. Mumler's report described an experiment in remote viewing. Responding to Anton Mesmer's theory of magnetic fluid, advocates profess to materialize thoughts as objects in the world. With remote viewing, 2 persons in different locations transmitted an image by means of thought from one to another. The photography of fluids, or thought photography, was advanced in Europe in the late 19th century. In 1896, Hippolyte Baraduc announced in Paris that he had succeeded in photographing thought by asking subjects to think intently of an object while holding a light-sensitive plate. That same year, Louis Darget in Tours announced comparable results by placing a plate against his forehead. Predating them by more than 2 decades, Mumler was perhaps the earliest to capture thought forms on a photographic plate. Looking beyond Gunning's source, the unconventional pair in the Eastman album conform with 9 in an album of 39 by Mumler at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Like those in the Eastman album, they are cartes de visite dating from the 1860s to the 1870s. Each shows the figure of a spirit standing alongside a photograph propped on what is now identifiable as a table. With the examples in the Getty album, and with Mumler's description of them as experiments in remote viewing, it's possible to assess Gunning's claim. In describing the Eastman example, Gunning identified the surface on which the carte de visite sat as a mantle. In fact, The setting was Mumler's studio, and the surface that of a table, a common prop of seances. While disclaiming any authorship of the images they produced, most spirit photographers, including Mumler, acknowledged their role as medium. In his autobiography, Mumler wrote that he had endeavored to describe, quote, my experience as an instrument in the hands of the dwellers in the invisible world, unquote. Mumler's remote viewing images affirmed his mediumship, by means of which the conveyed photograph was made to summon the dead to his camera. They used the familiar trope of the picture within a picture, but reversed. Where once stood the mourner, now stands a spirit. Where once stood an image of the deceased, now stands an image of the remote client. Using the conventions of posthumous mourning portraiture, nevertheless, they are not mourning images. Rather, as records of remote viewing, they better fit the classification photography of fluids or thought photography. While Gunning's example does not support his claim, that's no reason to conclude that his thesis was wrong. Research has not uncovered records of studios making spirit portraits other than as evidence for survival, but the absence of records does not negate the possibility that they did. Nor have I uncovered records of studios offering gag spirit photographs, yet such images are abundant and commonly acknowledged as a popular entertainment. Curator Clément Cheroux wrote of the seeming discrepancy between images made as evidence and those made as entertainment, quote, while the concomitance of these images was an embarrassment to the spiritualists, it did not seem to have bothered the public, unquote. The public was accustomed to that concomitance through the subjunctive mode of memorial portraiture. It was commonplace for mourning images to posit a manufactured memory. Conversely, the fact that it was commonplace suggests an unexpectedly pliant relationship to the indexical claim of such images by their commissioners. If consented to, the montage confers a degree of sophistication not usually accorded the makers and recipients of spirit pictures. Released from the burden of indexicality, spirit portraiture's function was not to portray death as did the postmortem photograph, but to serve in the rituals surrounding death. Mourning portraiture kept the form of the dead alive among the living, who visited and cared for the dead by visiting and caring for their images. Whether they did so as Christians or as spiritualists, the image served the belief system in which it operated. Just as spirit portraits employed the iconography of mourning portraiture, so mourning portraits may have employed the iconography of spirit portraiture. One use of the image was appropriate to Christian ritual and promised, we shall meet again. Another was appropriate to spiritualist ritual and promised, I am always with you